Good afternoon, Lions Nation. I hope you're all having an amazing day. Welcome back to the channel, where we cover the latest Detroit Lions news, rumors, breaking updates, and everything happening around the team. Today's story is one that every Lions fan needs to hear, because there are important developments that could have a major impact on the team's future. We'll break down exactly what's happening, what it means for Detroit, and why this situation has so many people talking. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you never miss another Lions update, and if you're confident this team is ready for another big season, hit that like button. Now let's get right into today's news. The Detroit Lions finally have something positive to focus on after days of conversations dominated by the situation involving Terrion Arnold. And honestly, this couldn't have come at a better time. While the uncertainty surrounding Arnold continues to generate questions about the future of the secondary, there is another side to this story that deserves just as much attention. There are reasons for optimism, there are encouraging developments inside this roster, and perhaps most importantly, there is growing evidence that this team is much stronger than many people are giving it credit for. Of course, before getting into the positive news, it's impossible to completely ignore the concerns surrounding the Lions' 2024 draft class. Looking back now, many fans naturally wonder whether that group will eventually live up to the expectations that surrounded it on draft night. But it's also important to remember something that often gets forgotten whenever hindsight enters the conversation. Brad Holmes simply could not have predicted everything that has happened. At the time those selections were made, there was every reason to believe Detroit was adding another outstanding group of young talent. Holmes wasn't coming off an average stretch of drafts. He had already established himself as one of the NFL's premier evaluators after assembling consecutive draft classes that dramatically changed the direction of this franchise. Just think about what those earlier drafts produced. Kirby Joseph quickly developed into one of the most impactful young safeties in football. Malcolm Rodriguez became one of the biggest draft steals, earning an important role on the defense despite being overlooked by many teams before entering the league. Even James Houston provided meaningful production early in his career. Then came the legendary 2023 class, a group that many fans already consider one of the greatest draft hauls in franchise history. When you build draft classes like that in consecutive years, expectations naturally become incredibly high. That's exactly why the conversation surrounding the 2024 class feels disappointing today. Not because Brad Holmes suddenly forgot how to evaluate talent, not because the process was flawed, but because football can be incredibly unpredictable. Nobody could have known that Terrion Arnold would find himself at the center of the current situation. Nobody could have predicted how events would unfold after he entered the organization. That isn't something any general manager can reasonably forecast during the draft process. Then there have been injuries that have complicated the development of other young players. Ennis Rakestraw Jr. has struggled to stay healthy. Giovanni Manu remains a long-term developmental project whose future still carries plenty of uncertainty. Sione Vaki is still working to establish exactly what role he'll eventually occupy inside this offense. Mekhi Wingo showed encouraging flashes before injuries interrupted his momentum. Tate Ratledge still has opportunities ahead if he can establish himself. Meanwhile, Christian Mahogany may currently be the player helping keep optimism alive regarding the overall success of this draft class. And that's an important point that shouldn't be overlooked. Writing off an entire draft after only one season is usually a mistake. Development in the NFL isn't always immediate. Some players need 2 years, others need 3. Injuries slow progress. Position changes require patience. Coaching adjustments can completely reshape careers. There is still time for this group to completely change the narrative. If Giovanni Manu develops into a reliable contributor, if Sione Vaki becomes an important rotational weapon, if Mekhi Wingo returns healthy and resumes his early progress, and if the remaining young players continue improving, today's disappointment could eventually become tomorrow's success story. That's why many Lions fans aren't ready to give up on this class yet. The frustration is understandable, the concern is real, but declaring failure this early simply ignores how long NFL player development often takes. Even successful organizations experience draft classes that don't immediately reach expectations. What separates elite front offices isn't perfection, it's their ability to consistently recover, adapt, and continue adding talent year after year. And Brad Holmes has already earned significant trust because of everything he accomplished before this class. Now, while fans continue debating the future of the draft class, another discussion has quietly become much more interesting. How should Detroit respond if the uncertainty surrounding the cornerback position continues? Surprisingly, the Lions aren't without options. There are still experienced veteran cornerbacks available who could provide depth if necessary. There are multiple free agents with years of starting experience who remain unsigned. Some have dealt with injuries, others are simply veterans looking for the right opportunity, but the market hasn't completely dried up. There's also the possibility that another team could become willing to discuss a trade if circumstances change before the regular season. Of course, making a trade always sounds simple from the outside. Fans love the idea of adding proven talent, but every trade comes with a cost. Draft picks, salary cap implications, future flexibility. Those are decisions Brad Holmes has to carefully balance rather than reacting emotionally to one difficult situation. And here's another interesting perspective that some people inside the Lions community have started discussing. As disappointing as everything involving Terrion Arnold has become, there was already significant pressure on him entering this offseason. The expectation wasn't simply that he would improve, he needed to take a major step forward. There were already conversations about refining his game, eliminating distractions, focusing entirely on football, and becoming the dependable corner Detroit expected when they drafted him. Instead, the organization now finds itself facing an entirely different situation. For now, though, the Lions have chosen not to rush into any permanent decisions. Rather than immediately moving on, they're allowing the legal process to continue before making any final determination about Arnold's future. That patient approach may frustrate some fans, but from the organization's perspective, gathering all available information before making a franchise decision makes complete sense. With that situation temporarily set aside, another storyline has started generating genuine excitement throughout Detroit, and it involves a player whose journey has completely changed the conversation surrounding this offense. Could Jameson Williams be on the verge of taking another massive leap that transforms an already explosive Lions offense into something even more dangerous? Jameson Williams has quietly become one of the biggest success stories on this Detroit Lions roster, and if we're being honest, a lot of people owe him an apology. There was a time when nearly every conversation about Williams centered around questions. Could he stay healthy? Could he become a complete receiver? Would he ever justify the investment Detroit made when they traded up to draft him? Every week seemed to bring another debate about whether his potential would ever translate into consistent production on the field. Now, those questions are starting to disappear. Instead of talking about what Jameson Williams might become, people are finally talking about what he already is, one of the most explosive weapons in the NFL. It's amazing how quickly narratives can change once production starts matching the talent everyone saw coming out of college. Not long ago, fans were growing impatient, wondering when the breakout season would finally arrive. Every missed opportunity felt magnified. Every incomplete deep pass created another wave of criticism. Some questioned his chemistry with Jared Goff, while others wondered if he would always be viewed simply as a speed receiver capable of making only occasional splash plays. But that version of the conversation doesn't reflect reality anymore. Williams has now established himself as an essential piece of Ben Johnson's former offensive blueprint, and with John Morton stepping into the offensive coordinator role, there's every reason to believe Detroit will continue finding creative ways to maximize his unique skill set. His production speaks for itself. Back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons have completely changed how opposing defenses prepare for the Lions offense. Defensive coordinators can't simply focus on Amon-Ra St. Brown. They can't load the box every snap to stop Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. They can't ignore Sam LaPorta working the middle of the field, because if they lose track of Jameson Williams for even a single play, the result can immediately become a game-changing touchdown. That's the type of stress he creates every time he lines up. What's even more impressive is how his relationship with Jared Goff has evolved. That chemistry wasn't built overnight. Early on, there were obvious growing pains. Timing routes weren't always synchronized. Deep balls occasionally fell incomplete because Goff and Williams simply hadn't developed the trust necessary for those difficult throws. Throwing to Jameson Williams isn't like throwing to most NFL receivers. Many receivers create obvious separation before the quarterback releases the football. Williams is different. His elite speed allows him to win after the ball is already in the air. Sometimes, when Goff releases the pass, Williams doesn't even appear open yet. To the average viewer, it almost looks like a risky decision. Then, within seconds, his acceleration completely changes the picture. He separates, he tracks the football, and suddenly what looked like a dangerous throw becomes a spectacular explosive play. That takes tremendous trust from a quarterback. It also requires countless repetitions during practice. Over time, Goff has learned exactly how Williams runs, when to release the football, and how much confidence he can place in his receiver's ability to simply outrun defenders. Does that trust occasionally lead to mistakes? Absolutely. There are moments when forcing the football toward Williams creates turnovers or incompletions because the timing isn't perfect, but that same confidence is also responsible for some of the biggest offensive plays Detroit has produced over the last 2 seasons. Sometimes the reward outweighs the risk, and that's exactly why this connection has become so dangerous. Another encouraging development is that Detroit no longer appears interested in using Williams only as a deep threat. That's perhaps the biggest evolution in his game. When many fans think about Jameson Williams, they immediately picture long touchdown receptions. Those highlight plays will always be part of his identity. But limiting him to that role would be wasting one of the offense's most dynamic athletes. Getting him involved early changes everything. Quick screens, intermediate crossing routes, jet motions, designed touches, simple completions that allow him to use his acceleration in open space. Those types of plays can completely change the rhythm of an offense. When Williams touches the football early, he becomes even more engaged throughout the game. His confidence grows. His energy becomes contagious, and suddenly defenses have another major problem to solve because they can no longer assume he's only running vertical routes. Sometimes a simple 12-yard reception becomes a 20-yard gain because of what he does after the catch. That part of his game doesn't always receive the same attention as the spectacular deep touchdowns, but it may actually be just as valuable over the course of an entire season. Every offensive coordinator dreams about explosive plays. Yes, long touchdown drives are important, but if you ask any play caller whether they'd rather execute 12 perfect plays or score in 2, the answer is usually obvious. Explosive offenses change games. Detroit already has one of the league's most talented offensive groups. Jared Goff continues to provide stability at quarterback. The running back combination remains among the NFL's best. Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to perform like one of football's elite receivers. Sam LaPorta gives the offense another dangerous mismatch. And now Jameson Williams is no longer viewed as simply an exciting young player with potential. He's becoming one of the reasons this offense can legitimately overwhelm opposing defenses every single week. If his development continues at this pace,